I'm Rose, 26, and when my grandfather passed away, I thought the hardest part would be grieving him. But just a week later, my world shifted again. The inheritance he left me wasn't small. It was $10 million. That's when the man who abandoned me years ago, my father, suddenly showed up at my door with the same woman he left my mother for. He smiled like nothing had happened, calling himself family, demanding his share, as if the years of silence and absence had never existed. I wasn't the child he had walked away from anymore. I had a lawyer, the truth, and the very papers my father once signed to cut himself out of my life forever. What unfolded inside that courtroom was the first step in exposing just how far his greed could drag him, and how far I was willing to go to make sure he never touched what wasn't his. What followed wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal, lies, and a reckoning that none of us could escape. And it all began the moment he came back, thinking he could rewrite the past. The funeral felt like a storm that had been waiting years to break. My grandfather's casket sat at the front of the small chapel, surrounded by flowers that looked too polished, too artificial, as if they were trying too hard to soften the truth. He had been the only man who stayed in my life when every other male figure vanished. His steady voice and sharp eyes carried me through childhood, his hand always on my shoulder when the world tilted too far. And now, with him gone, I thought I had lost everything. That was before the lawyer pulled me aside, pressing an envelope into my hand with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly how much it weighed. $10 million. My name, my future, locked in neatly printed lines. For the first time in days, I could breathe. Not because of the money itself, but because it felt like a wall had been built between me and the chaos of my past. I imagined my grandfather smiling, the same half-smirk he wore whenever he won at chess. He'd left me secure, free, untouchable, or so I thought. The week after the will was read, I heard a knock at my door that sounded rehearsed. Too steady, too purposeful. When I opened it, the man standing there was a ghost I had prayed never to see again. My father. The man who had walked out on me and my mother when I was only 8 years old, leaving us for the woman he called his soulmate. He hadn't looked back once, not when Mom cried herself to sleep, not when bills piled up, not when I begged for answers. And now here he was, wearing a pressed suit, as if that alone could erase 2 decades of absence. "Sweetheart," he said, like the word had any weight left. I came as soon as I heard. His voice tried to carry warmth, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He already knew about the inheritance. Of course he did. News like that moved faster than grief. I didn't answer. Silence stretched between us until his wife appeared beside him. The same woman he'd abandoned us for, perfectly styled hair, designer heels that clicked against the stone of my porch, lips curled in a smile that didn't touch her eyes. She looked me up and down as though measuring whether the fortune was worth the trouble of pretending to be civil. "We just want to talk," my father said, hands spreading in a gesture that was supposed to suggest peace. "Families should stick together, especially in times like this." The words made my stomach twist. Family. He had given that up the moment he walked away. And I wasn't naive anymore. I knew why he was here. I let them talk. I listened to his wife chime in about shared bloodlines and responsibility, as though she were reading from a script. But the more they spoke, the clearer it became. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here for a cut. When I closed the door in their faces, I already knew the next step. I wasn't going to let them corner me with guilt or pretty speeches. I called my lawyer. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeped into bones, where whispers felt sharper than shouts. My father sat across from me, his arm draped casually around his wife's shoulders, their confidence painted on thick. They believed this was theirs to win. They thought the law would side with blood over truth, with his sudden claim of fatherhood over the reality of abandonment. He kept glancing my way, as though expecting me to crumble under the weight of his presence. But I didn't flinch. I had been preparing for this moment since the night I watched him pack his bags, since the years I spent watching my mother struggle while he built a new life without us. Every scar he left had become armor. When the judge called the case to order, my lawyer stood with the ease of a man who knew he was about to end a performance before it began. He opened a folder, slow and deliberate, each movement designed to stretch the silence. My father straightened in his seat, his wife leaned forward, and then, calmly, surgically, my lawyer slid a document onto the judge's desk. It was the contract. The air shifted as soon as the paper was read. Years ago, when my father had remarried, he had signed away every right to me. In exchange for never paying child support, he had agreed to legally cut himself off from my life. The document was notarized, signed by witnesses, sealed with his own signature. His freedom had come at the cost of ever claiming me again. The judge's voice was steady as he read aloud the clause that gutted him. Each word was a hammer, breaking through the arrogance he had walked in with. I watched color drain from his face, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he could hold himself together by sheer force. His wife froze, the smugness evaporating as she leaned in to read the words herself. Her lips parted in disbelief, and in that instant, I saw her world fracture. She had married a man who had cut ties with his own child, believing she was securing a future tied to wealth and family connections. Instead, she was staring at a man who had legally abandoned me, and who now had nothing to gain. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. I sat back, letting the moment breathe. I didn't need to speak. The truth spoke louder than anything I could have said. My lawyer closed the folder with a quiet snap, final and unshakable. The case was over before it began. When the judge dismissed us, I rose without looking back. My father remained seated, pale, staring at the table like it might offer him a way out. His wife's hand slipped from his arm, her expression souring into something between rage and disgust. Whatever fantasy they had spun about reclaiming a piece of my grandfather's fortune had shattered in that courtroom. The courthouse doors had barely closed behind me before I realized silence never lasts long. My father might have been humiliated in front of the judge, but men like him didn't vanish quietly. I knew him too well. He had always been a man who built his survival on manipulation, wrapping words around people until they bent to his will. The courtroom stripped that away, yet the look in his eyes told me he wasn't finished. He was wounded, and wounded people with pride as large as his never stayed still. The next morning, a letter slid under my door. No return address. No name on the envelope. Inside, only a single line. This isn't over. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Years may have passed, but the sharp slant of his pen had not changed. It was the same handwriting that had once signed birthday cards, as if obligation alone was enough to pass for love. I held the paper for a long moment, then folded it and placed it on the counter. He wanted me rattled. He wanted me off balance. But I wasn't the child who once waited by the window for a father who never came home. I was a woman who had just walked out of court with everything intact. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease crawling up my spine. A man stripped of pride and potential wealth was unpredictable. And he wasn't alone. His wife was just as invested in the fantasy of fortune, and I had seen the fury burning behind her polished facade when the truth came out. Together, they were dangerous, not because of what they had, but because of what they had lost. Days passed, and whispers started reaching me. An acquaintance called to say my father had been at a local bar telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen money that was rightfully his. Another message came from a former neighbor, warning me he was asking around about where I lived, who I spent time with, what I was doing with the inheritance. He was building a story, trying to craft himself as the victim. I refused to let him take control of the narrative. My lawyer and I met again, this time not in the chaos of court, but in his office surrounded by shelves stacked with neat binders. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, his tone direct. He has no legal standing, he reminded me. But men like your father, they play outside the law when the law doesn't bend for them. Expect theatrics. I asked him what kind.
Public spectacle.
Pressure through gossip. He'll want to stain your name so that the money feels poisoned. If he can't take it, he'll try to make you regret having it. It wasn't a surprise. My father always thrived on control, and humiliation was the one thing he couldn't bear. The courtroom had cracked open his carefully constructed image, and now he was scrambling to stitch it back together. 2 weeks after the ruling, his performance escalated. I walked into a cafe near downtown, planning to meet a friend, when I saw him at a corner table, his wife beside him. They weren't there for coffee. They were there for me. He stood as if we were long-lost relatives stumbling into each other by chance. His smile was wide, forced, his voice raised just enough for the room to hear. "Look who it is," he said, gesturing toward me. "My daughter. The one who doesn't return calls. The one who keeps her father locked out of her life even after everything I've done for her." The room fell silent. Strangers turned to look. His wife placed a hand on his arm, her own expression painted with feigned sorrow. They were acting, staging a scene to pull sympathy from an audience that didn't know the script. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I told the barista I was leaving, my voice calm, my movement steady. But as I walked past his table, his words followed me like a shadow. "You'll regret this," he hissed, quiet enough so only I could hear. That night, I replayed the scene again and again. Not because I doubted my choices, but because I saw clearly now he wasn't going to stop. He was going to keep pressing, keep performing, until either I broke or the world turned against him. I needed to get ahead of him. My lawyer suggested a press statement, short, clean, factual. The document was public record. The world could see the contract he had signed, the one where he walked away from all responsibility in exchange for freedom. If he wanted to play this game in public, then the truth would be my defense. We drafted the statement together. It was less than a page, but it carried the weight of years. My father had legally renounced all rights to me. He had no claim. The inheritance was mine. End of story. When it went out, I expected backlash. Instead, something else happened. People started calling him out. Neighbors remembered how quickly he vanished after marrying his new wife. Old colleagues remembered his habit of slipping away from responsibility. Even acquaintances online pointed to the documents, to the judge's ruling, to the clarity of the law. The narrative he tried to spin collapsed in real time, and for once, I didn't have to fight alone. The truth was fighting for me. But humiliation doesn't end a man like my father, it only sharpens him. He appeared at my mother's house one evening, pounding on the door until she called the police. By the time they arrived, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his fists against the wood. My mother called me shaking, her voice breaking as she asked if this was ever going to stop. I promised her it would. I had no idea how yet, but I meant it. The next escalation came not from him, but from her, his wife. She cornered me in a parking lot after I left a meeting downtown. She stepped out from behind a car, heels clicking against the pavement, eyes cold. "You think you've won," she said. "But you don't know him like I do. He doesn't quit. And if he loses everything, don't think he'll go down alone. He'll take you with him." Her tone was less a threat than a warning, but it landed the same. She wanted me unsettled. Instead, I studied her. For the first time, I saw cracks in her confidence. Her posture was tight, her words edged with fear. She wasn't warning me out of loyalty. She was warning me because she knew she had tied herself to a sinking ship. I didn't respond. I walked past her, keys clenched in my hand, and slid into my car without looking back. Driving home, the thought hit me, maybe the real unraveling wasn't mine. It was theirs. My inheritance had become a mirror. To me, it reflected stability, freedom, a chance to build a future. To them, it reflected failure, regret, a reminder of choices they couldn't undo. My father had signed away his rights for the sake of a woman who now saw him as a liability. His wife had married a man she believed would guarantee her security, only to discover he had legally abandoned it years earlier. The fortune they wanted so desperately wasn't just out of reach. It was a spotlight exposing their greed. The morning his downfall became irreversible began with another knock at my door. I expected the same rhythm from weeks earlier, but this one was frantic, uneven, almost desperate. When I opened it, there wasn't my father, but a deputy holding a folded notice. It was a restraining order request my father had actually filed against me. His claim was absurd, that I was harassing him, threatening his safety, using the inheritance to ruin his life. I laughed once, quietly, then stopped. This wasn't a joke. It was his last move, a final attempt to flip the story. If he couldn't touch my money, he'd try to stain my name through the courts again. My lawyer wasn't surprised when I called. He's burning the last bridges he has left, he said. This is desperation. Don't underestimate what desperate people do. The hearing was scheduled within the week. I spent the days leading up to it studying myself, rehearsing not just what I would say, but what I would not allow him to make me feel. I had seen the way he twisted truth into performance, and this time, I refused to give him a stage. The courtroom was smaller than the one from before, but no less heavy. My father walked in looking hollow, shoulders slumped but eyes still searching the room for an audience. He had no wife beside him now. She had vanished from his life completely, her absence louder than any betrayal he could accuse me of. He stood alone, clutching a stack of papers that shook in his hands. When the judge asked him to speak, he launched into a monologue. He painted himself as the abandoned parent, the forgotten man cast aside by an ungrateful daughter. He claimed he had given me everything a father could give and that I had chosen greed over love. His words tumbled over each other, louder with each sentence, until even the clerk beside the bench shifted uncomfortably. I let him speak. I let him pour out every accusation, every invented memory, every false claim. Because I knew what was coming. When my lawyer rose, his voice was calm, measured. He didn't need theatrics. He simply placed the familiar contract on the table and reminded the court, this man had willingly, knowingly, signed away his rights. He had chosen freedom over responsibility, comfort over obligation. He was not the abandoned one, he was the one who abandoned. Then my lawyer unfolded new evidence. Records from the past months, false claims he had filed, the incident at my mother's home, the staged outburst at the cafe, the letter slid under my door. Each piece was laid out with precision, showing a man spiraling further into obsession, each act revealing not harassment from me, but harassment toward me. The silence that followed was crushing. My father tried to interrupt, but his voice cracked, desperation cutting through the arrogance he once wore like armor. The judge silenced him with a single command. The ruling was swift. His request was denied, and instead, the court granted me a permanent order of protection. My father could no longer come near me, my mother, my home, or my life. He was barred from contact in every form. The contract he had signed years ago remained unshakable, and now, legally, he had lost even the power to show up at my door. The look on his face was not just defeat, it was collapse. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of every choice had finally crushed him. He had nothing left to argue, nothing left to manipulate, nothing left to reach for. His wife was gone, his pride shattered, his reputation buried, his access to me cut off permanently. I stood when the hearing ended.
He didn't look at me.
For the first time, he had no words. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt air fill my lungs without resistance. It wasn't just relief, it was finality. This wasn't like the first hearing, where humiliation had left him hungry for retaliation. This was different. The system had locked every door he might have tried to pry open. There were no more loopholes, no more staged performances, no more illusions. Life moved forward quickly after that. I invested part of my inheritance in building the life my grandfather had wanted me to have. I made sure my mother never had to worry about bills again. I donated to causes that mattered to me, not because I owed anyone proof of generosity, but because I wanted my grandfather's legacy to be more than numbers in a bank account. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about my father. A neighbor mentioned seeing him alone at a diner, staring at an empty plate for hours. Another said he'd tried to borrow money, telling stories that no one believed anymore. His name became associated with pity rather than respect, his presence reduced to shadows on the edge of conversations. He had once wanted to be remembered as the man who escaped responsibility for freedom. Now he was remembered only as the man who threw everything away and ended with nothing. I didn't gloat. I didn't chase revenge.
I didn't need to.
His choices had written his ending long before my grandfather's inheritance ever entered the picture. All I had done was hold up the contract and let the truth reveal itself. The last time I thought of him with any weight was late one evening when I found myself back in my grandfather's old house. The rooms were quiet, filled with the scent of polished wood and the faint echo of his presence. I stood in his study, where the chessboard still sat as if waiting for him to make the next move. I realized then that my grandfather had known. He had seen the kind of man my father was long before I ever understood it. Leaving me the inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about protection. It was his way of ensuring that no matter how loudly my father tried to return, the door would already be closed. That night, I closed the study door and locked it, not because I needed to, but because it felt right. A symbolic end to a game that had dragged on too long.